Alright, so I bet you're all expecting me to say how wrong I was about how boring this episode was going to be, about how great this episode ended up being, and how this fight ended up completely subverting my expectations. And, to an extent, you're right. I think the approach that they took with Martian Manhunter versus Silver Surfer was much better than literally any other alternative they could have taken, I think. And that approach really makes it stand out amongst the rest of the other Marvel vs. DC episodes. On the other hand, everything else in this episode just kind of devolves into the same stuff we've seen 1,000 times before. The analysis were pretty solid. The main appeal of this episode is when they're more focused on the character stories more so than their powers. A lot of the versus stuff just falls into the same stuff we've seen plenty of times before. Martian Manhunter taking a hit from DC's equivalent of God was pretty cool and all, but it wasn't much different from the same stuff we've seen already. There were some fun gags like the Death's Door bit from Surfer's rundown, and Boomstick struggling to pronounce Mixis-Pitalik, I think that's his name. Mixis-Pitalik's name. The cutaways were fine. I think the Surfer Boomstick bit was a bit too much, but I respect what they were going for. Like I said before, the main appeal of the rundowns were when they're just focusing on the character stories rather than the versus stuff, which to me is more interesting than any other versus related thing they could talk about. Honestly, learning more about these characters was really fun and really interesting. I already liked Martian Manhunter from the stuff I had seen from him, like in the Justice League cartoon and whatnot, but learning more about him and his tragic tale really made me appreciate him more. Same with the Silver Surfer. I knew basically nothing about him before this episode, and learning more about him and his equally tragic tale was just as fun and just as interesting. But a lot of the rundown was also just a bunch of versus stuff talking about universal destruction and whatnot, which is necessary for deciding the victor, I know, but it's still kind of just bland. That's it for the rundowns. There wasn't really much to talk about besides a few things, but you know, they were serviceable. They weren't like bad by any means. Anyways, moving on to the fights. Honestly, the beginning of it sets the tone beautifully. It immediately sets it up for something much more character focused rather than one focused on all their cool powers. The noir setting helps sets the tone perfectly, along with the very low energy music as well as the dialogue. Also alongside the phenomenal voice acting of Kamran Nikad and Paul Guyette. If that's not how it's pronounced, I'm very sorry. Kamran's take on Manhunter sounds so much like Carl Lumbly's Manhunter that for a split second I thought that they actually got the guy to play him in this episode. It's crazy that this is the same guy that brought us this iconic one. Crazy how talented some of these people are. Paul Surfer is also really good. Like I said, I know less about Surfer than I do about John, but I think the voice Paul puts on for Surfer fits him really well. And both of them get some great lines later, especially Surfer. Now, here comes probably my biggest gripe with the episode. Everything that was shown during the preview was really excellent and did set up for the more character-centric fight that we were going to get, but everything after that up until John clones himself is just Surfer flying after him and shooting lasers really slowly in really drawn-out shots. There's this one shot at the very beginning that's from a top-down angle that for some reason reminded me of those old LEGO Star Wars games, or I guess more accurately a arcade shooter of some kind. And there's also a POV shot from Surfer, but a lot of it is just Surfer flying after John and shooting lasers, again, very slowly. And it takes up nearly a whole minute of the fight. It's not nearly as bad as Jason Michael when there's nearly 2 minutes worth of Jason versus Michael not fighting, but considering how slow all of the fighting and shooting shots were from this fight, it did make it feel a lot longer and more sluggish than it actually was, and it really kills the pacing in my opinion. I know this fight was more focused on character, like I said before, which is totally fine. I prefer character-centric fights any day of the week, but you still need to have an interesting fight, you know? You can't just fully focus on character and just ignore the fight aspect of Death Battle. You can't ignore the battle aspect of Death Battle. SpongeBob vs. Aquaman was also mostly character-driven, but there was still lots of fun fight stuff going on in spite of that. Though, that episode did have more to work with in terms of out-of-the-box arsenal stuff. This episode, when it's not heavily focusing on character, like in the beginning and end, is mostly just a lot of generic flying brick combat, which is exactly what I said most of it was going to be. Thankfully, this one bit isn't enough to make the episode super bad in my opinion, or even average, because right after that scene ends, we get a bunch of cool stuff, like John using a bunch of clones, a pose reference from the Silver Surfer, which I'm glad they showed that panel during the rundown so I could understand it later. Thanks, guys. There's this awesome shot of John transforming into a dragon while snapping Surfer's board in half. It was really impactful. I really like that. Speaking of which, the hand-drawn dragon that John turns into is really freaking cool looking, and it shifts the whole dynamic of the fight for a moment in a really cool way, and you can even tell by the track how it shifts to a more dramatic and I guess more intense. I don't really know how to describe it, but it changes in its tone very noticeably, and I really like that. I love the shot of Surfer moving out of the way, only for John to slice the moon behind him into ribbons. It was really cool looking. Though I will say, this isn't really a criticism, it's more of, I guess, a nitpick. But I do wish that they did more with John's shapeshifting than they did with this episode, since that's one of the main things that this character is known for, and one of the main things that makes him cool, in my opinion, besides his character and his backstory. And they only used that power once to turn him into a big old dragon, which is fine. They used it well in that scenario. I just wish they used more of it, because it would have added more interesting fight dynamic stuff, but they did not do much of that. Though, I think we all know the real highlight of the fight is basically everything after Surfer throwing John into the sun. And we get a climax that's honestly hard to try and put into words. But I think you all can kind of get the gist of why it's so great. Though I'm still going to try. I think what makes this scene so good is the understanding that these two characters come to right before the end. They know that they are both here to fight to the death for reasons they don't understand. And John, knowing that both of them know this, tells Surfer that he hopes he can live with that uncertainty of not knowing why he was forced to kill this person he holds no ill will to. Surfer's final speech is so well delivered, once again showing off how talented Paul is as a voice actor. You can hear the somberness in his voice as he's going over to himself how he'll never know why he was made to fight this person he has no ill will towards, and the overall thought process of if violence is truly justified in any scenario. But his tone turns a bit more hopeful towards the end as he comes to the conclusion that while it may be a concept beyond his understanding, there might be something worthy of justifying a fight like this, as we see John accept his death as he realizes that he'll finally get to see his family again that he lost so long ago. The final shot is also really good, going back to the noir theme for the very end as Surfer sits there alone in space as he contemplates what he's done as the music slowly fades out. Something he's very familiar with, it seems. What a phenomenal death, and in my opinion could be a contender for one of the best of the season and probably the series, depending on who you're talking to. Everything from the voice acting, the build-up, the music, the visuals, it all just comes together for this incredibly somber and sad final scene that perfectly fits the two characters. It was a great way to end the episode. A few more broader things that I want to bring up before I give it a proper ranking. I like how this episode actually does have some cosmic level feats in it. Most fights that involve cosmic level characters talk about how overwhelmingly powerful they are, but don't really sell it that much in the actual fight animation. At least they used to. With a lot of modern episodes now, they've really been starting to emphasize that more. Heck, even with Phoenix vs. Raven, they did that like 2 episodes ago, which is something that I liked about that episode. The track is also pretty good. I like the more subdued and subtle take that it was going for compared to the more bombastic and metal-based tracks that kind of surround this series, which are always good. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay them. They are always good. Thorwolf and Brandon, they can never do anything wrong. But I feel like if Thorwolf did do something similar to some of the previous tracks that he's done, it wouldn't fit the fight's atmosphere as well. I did like how the track took a more menacing tone when John transforms into the giant dragon, like I mentioned earlier, and then it starts to build up more during the final scene when Surfer starts inflating the sun, I guess. I don't really know what he's doing there, but I like it when music complements the scene and stuff like that. Alright, now to rank it. Honestly, this one's pretty tough, because while I more or less enjoyed the analysis and parts of the fight, that one nearly minute-long section of them just flying around and shooting lasers really killed the pacing for me, and the fact that besides the beginning and end, there really isn't much noteworthy during the middle of the fight besides John's admittedly great dragon transformation. The ending definitely gives it a lot of bonus points though, don't get me wrong, because the ending is genuinely great. But it just has a lot of small things that kind of all pile up that brings it down just a tad. I do think it's better than the previous 2 Marvel vs. DC fights this season, even though I do think Raven vs. Phoenix had a lot more going on in terms of a dynamic just throughout the course of the entire fight. Because while Martian vs. Surfer has a lot of big stand-up moments, like in between a bunch of like mediocre points, Phoenix vs. Raven has stuff going on throughout the entire thing. Like it has like a consistent pace of there's a lot of stuff going on. So I'm not really sure it might be tied. I think they're tied right now. I think that's probably the best way to say it. They're tied right now. So I'll probably give Martian Manhunter versus Silver Surfer an 8 out of 10 at the moment. It's definitely not a bad episode by any means, far from it. But I think it dropped the ball on keeping that dynamic interesting during the middle portion of the fight. But it is still a pretty solid episode, and I'd say holds its own amongst a lot of the other episodes this season, though nowhere near close to coming towards some of the peak stuff that we've gotten so far. Alright, moving on to the next episode, and it looks like we're at long last getting one of the ballad episodes next time, which I am very excited about. The cast has been talking about how absolutely wild that this episode is going to end up being, and I'm taking their word for it. This episode most definitely has the potential to be one of the trippiest and most fun episodes the series has, just given the characters involved. Plus, I'm just excited to see Bill Cipher in Death Battle. He's one of my favorite cartoon villains. I love Gravity Falls, not as much as other people. I'm not like a super duper fan, but I do really like Bill Cipher. He's a great villain. I love these kinds of like charismatic, like laid back sort of villains. And I'm excited to see Bill Cipher bounce off of Discord, who I think also has like a similar vibe to him going on. He probably does, considering they're matched up so often. But I'm very excited to see them interact and whatnot, and see all the crazy stuff that they get up to. Because you know what? These two matched up together pretty much scream out of the box fight dynamic. So, you know what? It's going to be fun. Guarantee it. Alright, that's all from me. I do feel kind of bad that I didn't have as much to say about this episode compared to other episodes this season, I feel. This episode just didn't have much to talk about aside from the death in the beginning, unfortunately. At least to me. If you like this episode and think there was more I didn't cover, let me know, because I'll probably bring up stuff I missed in my big season ranking at the end of the year. So, you know, there's that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out some of my non-Death Battle videos, because they're really fun. I'm very proud of them. Honestly, I had more fun making those than I do making these. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all later.